Hi, my name is Natalie. I am a second-year history student, and today we're going to be looking at the David Barron collection that is part of the CCCU Library Archives. I've been working on this collection as a part of my placement for Applied Humanities Employability and Practice, and I've been analyzing a few of the objects as well as the life of the man who this collection comes from, David Barron. David Barron was a prolific preacher and missionary who was originally born in 1855 in Lithuania to a rabbinic Jewish family. As a young man, Barron ended up immigrating to England, where he ended up converting to Anglicanism. Shortly after immigrating to England, David Barron ended up marrying a woman named Fanny Kingsford from Dover. Fanny was involved in the mission to the Jewish community in Kent at the time. Alongside some of their contemporaries, they ended up founding the Hebrew Christian Mission to Israel in London in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This organization worked to further the gospel to Jewish communities, from Jewish-born converts to Christianity. This collection raises many questions surrounding interfaith communities and interfaith dialogue, as well as the Christian proselytization of minority groups. One of the main aspects of David Barron's work involved proselytizing to immigrant Jewish communities in England, as well as communities in Eastern Europe. During the time that he was active, was also coinciding with many pogroms against Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. As we go through some of the objects here in the collection, we'll look at how Barron related the Old and New Testament, or Hebrew Bible, with the Christian New Testament, and how we can tell the connections he was trying to make between the two biblical sources. Through this, we'll also look at examples of Jewish culture that Barron was trying to highlight in his works as a missionary. This collection was donated to the library by a relative of Barron and his wife, Fanny Kingsford. And our first clue into what the collection is and where it came from is on the back of a card that catalogs the items in the collection. Here we have a note from Emily Kingsford saying Uncle David Barron's collection from Israel, which is our first clue on where most of these objects were attained, as well as the relation that this person had to David Barron, being a relative on his wife's side, the Kingsfords. We also have some dates here, which is 1872 and 1960, most likely referring to Emily Kingsford and her life. On the other side of this card, we have a list of 12 objects. While this collection has 15, there are 12 objects associated with different biblical verses, which we believe to have been associated with them by David Barron and then recorded later on by a family member. So with our first clue being that most of these objects may have come from a trip to Israel, we can now look further into the objects and the meanings that David Barron associated with them. The first objects that are listed here on our card are these tefillin and this door sign or mezuzah. These tefillin are used by Jewish men and wrapped around their arms as well as their head during prayer. And the mezuzah is posted onto a doorpost of a Jewish home, normally at an angle, and inside contains a scroll with blessings for the home. Both of these objects are mentioned in Deuteronomy 6, 8, and 9, and are also recited as being a part of the Shema. The Shema describes the covenant and agreement between God and the Jewish people, as well as the blessings they are given as being a part of this covenant, and the ways that they can remind themselves of their relationship to God, such as posting the mezuzah on their doorpost and practicing tefillin. The second object on the list is listed as the trumpet of a ram's horn and is associated with the verse Joshua 6:13. Today, the ram's horn, or shofar as it's called in Hebrew, is blown on the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. This would be a very recognizable object to the Jewish communities that David Barron was preaching to, as well as the mezuzah and tefillin. And we can see how he was associating these familiar verses and objects with his audience. There are a few different objects in the collection that may be associated with this next verse. However, this is the one that we believe is associated with Rebecca's pictures as listed by David Barron. The story of Rebecca and her pictures comes from the Old Testament, where Rebecca waters the camels of a messenger sent from Abraham, and this is seen as a sign of God for the messenger to take Rebecca back to wed one of Abraham's sons. Barron also connects this to Jesus sending out 2 of his disciples to fetch water, and this is just another example of Barron being able to connect these 2 biblical motifs together. Here we have 2 slings, which are connected with 1 Samuel 17, verses 40 and 50, where David slays Goliath by throwing stones with his slings. The next object is described as a roll of a book and is associated with the verse Jeremiah 36:2. There are actually 2 objects in this collection that this could be referring to. One is a miniature Torah scroll, and the other is a much larger portion of a scroll. Traditionally, scrolls are actually made out of animal skin, and the lettering is handwritten by an expert. Because a scroll is made out of animal skin, the oils on our own hands can actually smudge the writing, and on many old scrolls you can see the areas that have turned black from where people have been touching it. Synagogues today use a pointer tool when following along with the reading of the Torah in order to preserve the scroll for generations to come. Here are one of the objects that we believe to be referring to Rebecca's pitcher. However, it's most likely that this is actually the tear bottle Barron mentions as a part of Psalms 56, verse 88. This next object is one of my personal favorites from the collection. It is an oil lamp that is most likely ancient and could be Roman based on the design style. Barron associates this with Matthew 25, verse 1, where the parable that Jesus tells about the virgins and their lamp. We don't know exactly how David Barron was able to obtain an ancient object, if it is as old as we think. However, there may have been a possibility that it was being sold by a vendor in Israel or passed down to him. As you can see, this next object is broken in half. At first, we were confused if this was a deliberate choice or if it was accidental. However, upon reading the verse Mark 14:3, we realized that it was purposefully broken to refer to the story of a woman who anoints Jesus with oil before the crucifixion by breaking an alabaster jar with oil over his head. On the list, it's listed as an alabaster box, which was another aspect that was confusing when we were first categorizing the objects. Why would it be jar-shaped if it refers to a box? This is actually because the original Hebrew and Greek uses jar or box in translation. Here we have a coin purse, a souvenir coin purse, with a replica shekel, or ancient Israeli coin, in it. This object is associated with multiple verses in Matthew, which talks about money lending or the shekel themselves, and most interestingly, it also connects it with the verse surrounding the betrayal of Jesus by Judas and how he was paid 30 shekels to betray Jesus. Here we very clearly have the crown of thorns from Matthew 27:29, which was put on Jesus' head before the crucifixion. Next, we have a replica of the tomb of Jesus, which was probably a common souvenir in Israel that Barron used to associate with Matthew 27:60. As you can see, the stone also rolls back, revealing the empty tomb. One of the objects we have that doesn't have a biblical description attached to it is this wooden decoration with a Hebrew inscription on it. The second object is a depiction of Solomon's Gate in Jerusalem. Here we have, I believe, the makers at the bottom of it, as well as the English inscription of Prophet Samuel's Gate, and in Hebrew as well. As these two objects are not associated with a specific biblical verse, they are more likely to be souvenirs rather than anything else. Most of these objects were probably purchased from different markets, souvenir shops, and even Judaica stores in Israel. Barron takes his use of these a step further to use them in his biblical references and even possibly as visual tools in his preaching. It is especially intriguing that Barron chose objects that would be recognizable to Jewish people of his time, as well as Jewish people today. Many of these objects are a very interesting representation of aspects of modern and ancient Jewish life. In one way, Barron connecting these religious motifs between Judaism and Christianity can be a really good representation of interfaith connections between the two religions, as well as being an interesting take on Christian theology within the context of Barron's personal background. However, another side of this collection raises questions and conversations surrounding the ethical side of proselytization to oppressed groups, especially during a time where Jewish people in Europe were being heavily discriminated against based on their ethnicity and beliefs, and often by people who would identify as Christians. This is not to insult Barron's own beliefs or make them seem like they are not valid, but rather to raise awareness of the needs for ethical interfaith conversations surrounding religious beliefs, identity, and culture.